Sometimes the worst monsters are the ones who wear holy crosses and smile in daylight. Sometimes the gentlest souls are found in creatures we're taught to fear. In a medieval village, a young woman lies broken in the rain, her face telling stories of cruelty that should never be spoken. When the alpha vampire finds her bleeding on the cobblestones, something shifts inside him. For centuries, he has been nothing but hunger and shadow. But when she looks up at him without fear, he remembers what it felt like to have a sister. He cradles her face and whispers, "Who hurt you?" That night, the monster becomes something else entirely. What happens when evil finally meets its match? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had been falling for 3 days now, turning the cobblestones of Ravenshollow into slick mirrors that reflected the flickering torchlight from the church windows. In this forgotten corner of medieval Europe, where the mountains met the moors and civilization seemed to hold its breath, the village existed in a perpetual state of hushed reverence, or perhaps it was fear. The distinction had long since blurred, in a place where the church bells rang, not to call the faithful to prayer, but to remind them who held dominion over their souls. Father Benedict stood at his chamber window, his pale hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed his domain. The rain pleased him. It kept the villagers indoors, huddled around their meager fires, whispering prayers that would never reach heaven. At 63, Benedict possessed the kind of lean, austere beauty that made simple folk believe in divine favor. His silver hair caught the candlelight like a halo, and his dark eyes held the intensity of a man who had looked into the depths of human nature and found it wanting. What the villagers did not know, could never know, was that Father Benedict had been 33 for far longer than any mortal man should be. He had made certain bargains in the darkness beneath the church, traded certain promises for the kind of power that allowed him to reshape souls to his will. The corruption that flowed through Ravenshollow like poisoned water had its source in him, and he tended it with the care of a gardener, nurturing his most prized roses. Below, in the village square, a young woman moved through the rain with quick, careful steps. Elara had learned long ago to make herself small, invisible, unremarkable. At 19, she possessed a quiet beauty that might have graced a noble's court in different circumstances. Dark hair that caught copper highlights in the sun, eyes the color of autumn leaves, and a grace that no amount of rough treatment had managed to break. But in Ravenshollow, beauty was a curse, especially for an orphan under the church's protection. She had been brought to the village as a child, her parents lost to plague, and raised in the convent attached to St. Cornelius Church. The nuns had been kind enough in their way, teaching her to read and write, to tend herbs and heal simple ailments. But when she reached her 16th year and began to bloom into womanhood, the attention of certain men had fallen upon her like shadows at dusk. Father Benedict had noticed her first, of course. He noticed everything in his domain. The way she moved through her duties with quiet efficiency, the intelligence that sparked in her eyes when she read the scriptures, the defiance that she tried so hard to hide when faced with injustice. He had called her to private council sessions, ostensibly to discuss her spiritual development. These sessions had become increasingly uncomfortable, his questions more personal, his touch more frequent and lingering. When she had finally found the courage to refuse his advances 3 nights ago, his response had been swift and brutal. Not physical violence, Benedict was too clever for that. Instead, he had declared her possessed by demons of pride and lust, requiring severe penance. The beating had been administered by his loyal deacon, witnessed by the other church officials as a righteous act of spiritual cleansing. Her swollen eye and split lip were the visible marks, but the deeper wounds were carved into her spirit. Tonight, she hurried through the rain toward the modest cottage where old Martha lay dying. The village midwife had sent word that Martha was asking for her, wanting to share something important before the end came. Ilara had slipped from the convent after Compline, knowing she would face punishment for leaving without permission, but unable to ignore the desperate summons. The cottage stood at the very edge of the village, where the neat rows of buildings gave way to wild forest. Martha had lived here for 70 years, serving as healer and keeper of old wisdom, tolerated by the church because her skills were needed, but viewed with suspicion for her knowledge of herbs and remedies that predated Christian doctrine. Inside the one-room dwelling, a single candle cast, dancing shadows on the walls lined with dried herbs and mysterious bottles. Martha lay propped against rough pillows, her weathered face pale but her eyes still sharp with intelligence. When Ilara entered, shaking rain from her cloak, the old woman managed a smile despite her labored breathing. "Child," Martha whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. "I knew you would come. Close the shutters tight. What I must tell you is not for other ears." Ilara obeyed, plunging the room into the intimate glow of candlelight. She knelt beside the narrow bed, taking Martha's cold hands in her own. "What troubles you so urgently? Perhaps I can brew something for your pain. No herbs can cure what ails me now," Martha interrupted, her grip surprisingly strong. "But there are things you must know before I pass beyond their reach. About this village, about the church, about the evil that has taken root in sacred ground." Martha's words came in careful whispers, punctuated by fits of coughing that brought up blood. She spoke of girls who had disappeared over the years, always the pretty ones who caught the wrong attention, of screams that echoed from beneath the church on certain nights when the moon was dark, of payments made to silence questions and threats delivered to those who spoke too freely. "Father Benedict is not what he seems," Martha said, her eyes growing urgent. "I have lived long enough to remember when he first came to Ravenssallow. That was 40 years ago, child, and he has not aged a day. There are powers in this world older than Christ's love, darker than any hell the scriptures describe. He serves such powers, and in return they have given him unnaturally long life and influence over weak minds." Ilara felt ice forming in her stomach. "You speak of witchcraft. I speak of truth." Martha's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "And I speak of the danger you are in. He has marked you, child. Your refusal 3 nights ago was not the end, it was the beginning. When the moon goes dark again, in just 4 days' time, he will come for you. There is a chamber beneath the church where he conducts his true worship, and you are to be the offering." The candle flame guttered in a sudden draught, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent life. Ilara's hands trembled as she absorbed the implications of Martha's words. She had suspected that the corruption in Ravenshollow ran deeper than simple human weakness, but this revelation painted a picture so dark she could hardly comprehend it. "What can I do?" she whispered. "Where can I go? The church controls everything here, the law, the militia, even the noble families bow to Father Benedict's will." Martha struggled to sit up higher, her breathing becoming more labored. "There are older powers than his, child. Forces that existed long before his dark god took root in these lands. Legend speaks of guardians who walk between light and shadow, creatures of the night who remember what it means to protect the innocent." "You speak in riddles," Ilara said, frustration bleeding through her fear. "What guardians? What creatures?" "Some call them monsters," Martha replied, her voice barely audible now. "But monsters are often just angels whose purpose we do not understand. When all hope seems lost, when evil appears triumphant, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources." A heavy thud echoed through the cottage walls, the sound of boots on wet cobblestones, moving with purpose through the rain. Martha's eyes widened with sudden alarm. "They come sooner than I expected. Quickly, child, there is a loose stone behind the herb jars. There you will find." The door burst open without ceremony, admitting a gust of cold wind and 3 figures in dark robes. Deacon Marcus led them, his gaunt face twisted with righteous anger, followed by two of the church guards who served as Benedict's enforcers. Their torches cast hellish light through the small space, making the herbs and bottles seem to writhe with unnatural life. "The midwife sent word that you were here," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the cold authority of the church. "Father Benedict requires your immediate return for additional penance. Your unauthorized departure shows that the demons of disobedience still possess your heart." Ilara rose slowly, positioning herself between the intruders and Martha's bed. "I came to comfort a dying woman. Surely even your God would approve of such mercy." "Do not speak to us of God's will," Marcus snapped. "You are in no position to interpret divine purpose. Come now, or we will drag you back in chains as a heretic." Behind him, the guards fingered their weapons with obvious eagerness. These were not gentle men moved by religious conviction, but brutes who enjoyed their work. Ilara had seen them at their duties before, knew the casual cruelty they were capable of. She glanced back at Martha, who lay watching with eyes full of sorrow and resignation. "Give me a moment to say farewell," Ilara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You have said your farewells," Marcus replied. "The old woman will be dead before morning anyway. We are sparing her the burden of your corrupting presence." But as they moved forward to seize her, Martha spoke one last time, her voice carrying clearly despite her weakness. "The bloodline remembers," she said, her eyes locked on Ilara's. "When darkness comes calling, the bloodline remembers and calls to its own kind." The words meant nothing to Ilara, but something in them seemed to strike the deacon like a physical blow. His face went pale, and he gestured frantically to his companions. "Seize her! Now! The old witch seeks to corrupt her further with pagan babble." Strong hands grasped Ilara's arms, and she was hauled from the cottage into the driving rain. Behind them, Martha's weak laughter followed like a curse upon the wind. As they marched her through the village toward the looming bulk of Street Cornelius Church, Ilara caught sight of shuttered windows and barred doors. The villagers knew what was happening, but none would intervene. Fear had made cowards of them all. The church rose before them like a great stone beast, its spires clawing at the storm-darkened sky. Gargoyles leered down from the corners of the roof, their carved faces expressing the kind of malevolent joy that seemed to mock divine mercy. The great doors stood open, revealing an interior lit by hundreds of candles that cast more shadows than light. Father Benedict waited in the nave, his hands clasped in apparent prayer before the great crucifix that dominated the altar. He did not turn as they entered, but his voice carried clearly in the cavernous space. "Bring her forward, brothers. The time for gentle correction has passed." As they forced her down the aisle between the wooden pews, Ilara felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. This was not just a church, but a place where faith had been twisted into something terrible, where prayers rose like screams and absolution came at the price of innocence. When they reached the altar, Benedict finally turned to face her. In the candlelight, his face seemed to shift and waver, as if the holy light could not quite decide what it was illuminating. His smile was gentle, paternal, and absolutely terrifying. "My dear child," he said, his voice soft as silk and cold as winter stone, "your rebellion grieves my heart, but it does not surprise me. The demon in you grows stronger as the dark moon approaches. But we shall cast it out, you and I, in the sacred chamber below where such work is properly done." Ilara felt the last of her courage crumble as she realized that Martha's warnings had been true in every terrible detail. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the old woman's cryptic words about guardians and bloodlines, about salvation from unexpected sources. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the church walls, something ancient stirred to wakefulness, drawn by the scent of innocence in peril and the echo of old promises that transcended death itself. The creature that had once been Lord Aldwyn Blackthorn moved through the forest with predatory grace, his footsteps silent on the rain-soaked earth. 3 centuries had passed since his transformation from nobleman to something far darker, and in all that time he had never felt the stirring that now pulled at his consciousness like a half-remembered melody. He had been feeding when it began, draining the life from a brigand foolish enough to waylay travelers near the village boundaries. The blood had been bitter with fear and desperation, satisfying his hunger but providing no pleasure. Then, carried on the storm wind, had come the scent of something pure in terrible danger, and with it the echo of a voice he had thought lost forever. Asterisk, help me, brother. Please help me. Asterisk, his sister Evelyn's final words, spoken as she lay dying in his arms while their family's castle burned around them. He had been too weak then, too human to save her from the plague that swept through their lands. By the time he had gained the power to protect those he loved, there was no one left to protect. Now, as he approached the village of Raven's Hollow, that same desperate plea seemed to whisper through the rain. Not Evelyn's voice this time, but something equally innocent, equally in need of salvation. For the first time in 3 centuries, purpose stirred within his dead heart. The church bells tolled midnight as he reached the village square. The cobblestones gleamed wetly in the torchlight, and somewhere in that light a figure lay crumpled and still. The vampire's enhanced senses immediately catalogued what his eyes confirmed: a young woman, barely more than a girl, beaten and left in the rain like refuse. He found himself kneeling beside her before conscious thought intervened. Her face was a canvas of fresh bruises, one eye swollen shut, her lips split and bleeding. Dark hair plastered against her skull by the rain, and beneath the scent of blood and pain, something else, a purity of spirit that should have repelled him, but instead drew him like a moth to flame. When she stirred at his approach, he expected the terror that usually greeted his presence. Instead, her one good eye opened and met his gaze with startling directness. She should have seen death looking back at her, all mortals did. But this girl simply studied his face with weary acceptance, as if she had already made peace with whatever fate awaited her. "Are you another one of them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. The question pierced him with unexpected force. Another one of them, the men who had hurt her, marked her, left her broken in the street like discarded trash. That she could look at him, a creature of obvious predatory nature, and wonder if he was simply another human monster spoke volumes about what she had endured. "No," he replied, his voice roughened by centuries of disuse. "I am something else entirely." She managed what might have been a smile with her ruined lips. "Good. I've had enough of their kind for one lifetime." He found himself reaching toward her face with infinite gentleness, his pale fingers barely touching the bruises that marred her skin. She did not flinch away, even when his touch must have felt cold as winter stone. Instead, she leaned into it slightly, as if starved for any contact not meant to cause pain. "Who did this to you?" The words emerged as barely controlled growl, rage building in his chest like a furnace coming to life. "The church," she whispered. "Father Benedict and his righteous servants. I refused his advances, so I must be possessed by demons of lust and pride. The beating was to drive them out." Her laugh was bitter as fallen leaves. "Tomorrow night, when the moon goes dark, there will be worse. Much worse." The vampire's hands clenched into fists as memories flooded through him. Evelyn's terrified face as plague-maddened villagers accused her of witchcraft, the way she had been dragged to the church for purification that became torture, her broken body when he finally found her. History repeating itself with sickening precision, innocence crushed beneath the weight of corrupted faith. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no refusal. And she did. Through chattering teeth and pain-thickened words, Ilara painted a picture of systematic corruption that made his undead blood run cold. Father Benedict's unnatural longevity, his influence over the village's power structure, the disappearances of young women who caught his attention, the chamber beneath the church where screams echoed on moonless nights. The complicity of nobles and merchants who profited from the priest's protection. Martha tried to warn me, Ilara continued, her voice growing weaker. She said there were guardians who walked between light and shadow, creatures who protected the innocent. But I think she was just trying to give me hope before what? The vampire prompted when she trailed off. Before they took me to him tonight, I escaped, but only barely. He was waiting in the chamber below, with chains and braziers and things I don't have words for. I fought free and ran, but his deacon caught me in the square. They said I had proven my demon possession by fleeing divine judgment. The beating had been punishment for her escape, but also demonstration. Let the village see what happened to those who defied the church's will. Tomorrow night, when the moon went dark and Benedict's power reached its peak, they would drag her back to those chambers for the final ritual that would either break her completely or kill her. As she spoke, the vampire felt something awakening within him that had lain dormant for centuries. Not hunger, not the predatory satisfaction of the hunt, but protective fury that burned brighter than the sun that would destroy him. This girl, this innocent creature who looked at monsters without flinching, had become the vessel for every soul he had failed to save. "What is your name?" he asked, though he found he already knew, as if the knowledge had been whispered by the wind itself. "Ilara," she replied. "And you? What manner of guardian angel wears such a fearsome face?" "I am no angel," he said, unable to suppress a harsh laugh. "I am what your church would call abomination, damnation made flesh. But if you will accept help from such a source, I swear to you that Father Benedict's darkness will not touch you again." She studied his face with those remarkable eyes, seeing past the inhuman beauty to the core of purpose that drove him. "I don't care what you are," she said finally. "If you can stop him, if you can keep him from hurting other girls the way he hurt me, then I'll gladly accept help from the devil himself." "Not the devil," the vampire replied, gathering her carefully into his arms as he rose. "Something far more dangerous to your enemies. I am vengeance delayed but not denied, justice that comes in darkness when daylight fails to serve." As he carried her toward the abandoned mill at the village's edge, a place where she could rest safely while he began his work, Ilara's head fell against his shoulder with exhausted trust. For the first time in 3 centuries, someone had placed their faith in him, not as predator but as protector. "Will you kill them all?" she asked drowsily, the trauma and cold finally overwhelming her consciousness. "Every last one," he promised, his voice carrying the weight of an oath sworn before powers older than Christ or devil. "And I will make certain they understand why they are dying." The confession booth key that Ilara had stolen during her escape lay heavy in her pocket, and as the vampire's enhanced hearing detected the approaching footsteps of Benedict's search parties, he smiled for the first time in memory. The priest had made the mistake of marking this girl as his victim, but she belonged to someone far older and infinitely more patient. Let Benedict conduct his dark rituals and call upon his corrupted powers. He was about to learn that some hungers could not be sated, and some protectors would not be denied their just revenge. The hunt was about to begin. The abandoned mill stood like a monument to better times, its great wheel frozen by years of neglect and the debris of countless storms. Inside, the vampire had created a sanctuary of sorts, dry, defensible, and far enough from the village proper to avoid casual discovery. Ilara slept on a bed of clean straw covered with his own cloak, her breathing finally steady after hours of fitful rest. As dawn approached, bringing with it the burning weakness that confined him to shadow, the creature studied the leather-bound ledger he had taken from the tax collector's lifeless hands. Marcus Grimwald had been Benedict's financial arm, bleeding the village dry through systematic extortion disguised as holy taxation. The records painted a picture of corruption so vast it took the vampire's considerable intellect to fully comprehend its scope. Every transaction told a story of calculated cruelty. Widow Thompson's grain tithe doubled after her husband died, forcing her to sell her only cow. Young Garrett's family taxed into starvation for the crime of questioning why the church needed gold when villagers went hungry. And threading through it all, payments to silence witnesses, bribes to secure cooperation, and the careful documentation of who could be trusted and who required elimination. "Sweet Mary, preserve us," Ilara whispered from her makeshift bed. The vampire turned to find her sitting up, staring at the spreading bloodstain on his sleeve where morning light had touched him through a gap in the shutters. "The sun burns creatures like me," he explained simply, moving deeper into the shadows. "But not fatally, merely painfully. I have endured worse." She rose unsteadily, her bruises having darkened overnight into spectacular purples and yellows. Despite her injuries, she moved with purpose, closing the shutters more tightly and checking each gap with the thoroughness of someone who understood the value of sanctuary. "You killed Grimwald," she said, not quite a question. "I did, quickly and quietly, though he deserved neither mercy." The vampire set the ledger aside and studied her face for signs of revulsion or fear. Instead, he found only weary acceptance and something that might have been satisfaction. Good. He was poison in human form, bleeding families dry while children starved. But his death will not go unnoticed. Benedict will know. Something hunts his servants. Let him know. Fear will make him careless, and careless men make mistakes. The vampire moved to a wooden chest he had positioned in the deepest shadow. From it he withdrew another book, older, bound in strange leather, its pages filled with symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. "What is that?" Ilara asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected. "Grimwald's true ledger, the one that records transactions not made in gold, but in blood and soul. Your father Benedict has been very busy these past 40 years. Ilara approached cautiously, and the vampire found himself noting how her natural grace persisted despite her injuries. She carried herself like nobility, though he suspected she had no idea of her own unconscious elegance. The true ledger revealed the scope of Benedict's supernatural network. Names of nobles who had sold their daughters' innocence for political protection. Merchants who had traded their souls for prosperity while their competitors mysteriously sickened and died. Village leaders who had turned blind eyes to disappearances in exchange for positions of authority. "Lord Aldrich," Ilara breathed, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly throughout the records. "I should have known. His son Edmund has been among the worst of Benedict's followers, always present when girls go missing." The vampire's finger traced the entries beside Edmund's name. 3 young women over the past 2 years, all daughters of families who had opposed Aldrich's land seizures. All had vanished during the Dark Moon rituals, their bodies never found. "He participates directly in the ceremonies," the vampire observed. "Not merely as witness, but as active celebrant. The records indicate he has developed quite an appetite for such entertainment." "Entertainment," Ilara's voice carried a bitter edge. "That's what they call it when they tear apart everything good and innocent in this world." The vampire looked up from the ledger to find her staring out through a crack in the shutters at the village below. Morning light revealed Ravenshollow in all its deceptive beauty, neat cottages with flower gardens, the great church spire reaching toward heaven, children playing in the square under their mothers' watchful eyes. It looked like paradise if you didn't know what lurked beneath the surface. "Tell me about the others," he said quietly. "The girls who disappeared." Ilara was silent for a long moment, her shoulders tense with remembered pain. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Sarah Miller was first. 16, beautiful, kind to everyone despite her family's poverty. She caught Edmund's eye at the harvest festival. 2 weeks later she was gone. Her parents were told she had run away with a traveling merchant, but Sarah would never have left her little brother. She named them all, one by one. Margaret, the baker's daughter, who had refused Edmund's advances and been accused of theft. Anne, the weaver's girl, who had witnessed something she shouldn't have seen. Each name carved itself into the vampire's memory with the weight of failed responsibility, echoes of his sister's fate multiplied across decades. They were all like me, Elara continued. Young, relatively pure, and unprotected by family wealth or position, perfect victims for men who believe their desires supersede everything else. The vampire closed the ledger with deliberate care. Edmund Aldrich will die tonight. Not quickly, not quietly, and not without understanding exactly why he is being judged. You speak of judgment, but what gives you the right to decide who lives and dies? Elara asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than condemnation. 3 centuries of watching evil flourish while good men do nothing, the accumulated weight of every innocent soul I failed to save, and the simple fact that no one else has the power or will to stop them. He met her gaze directly. Would you have me show mercy to those who showed none to your friends? No, she said immediately, but I would have you be careful. Benedict has protected his network for decades. They will not fall easily to simple violence. There is nothing simple about what I do, the vampire replied. Each death will be precisely calculated to sow fear in the survivors while gathering intelligence about their operations. By the time I reach Benedict himself, he will be isolated, desperate, and vulnerable. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses echoed from the village below. Through the shutter crack, they could see a party of riders approaching the church, Lord Aldrich himself, flanked by his son Edmund and a dozen armed guards. Even at this distance, the vampire could smell their arrogance and barely contained violence. They come to plan your recapture, he observed, watching the way Edmund's head turned toward every young woman in the square. Your escape has disrupted their timeline. The dark moon is tomorrow night, Elara said, unconsciously touching the bruises on her face. If they cannot find me, they will choose another victim rather than delay their ritual. Someone younger, more vulnerable, less likely to fight back. The vampire's voice carried the cold certainty of long experience with human evil. Elara's face went pale as the implication struck her. Mary Fletcher. She's only 14, but she's been asking questions about the missing girls. Benedict has been watching her. Then tonight, while they search for you in the forest, I will pay young Edmund a visit. And tomorrow, while they mourn their lost enforcer, you and I will ensure that no more innocents feed their darkness. The vampire began checking his weapons, silver daggers blessed by priests long dead, a crossbow strung with blessed wire, and other tools accumulated over centuries of hunting supernatural prey. But his most lethal weapon was his patience, honed by decades of planning perfect revenge. In the village below, the church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to morning prayers. Soon, those same bells would ring for the dead. Aldrich Manor crouched on the hill above Raven's Hollow, like a stone predator surveying its domain. Built 3 centuries past by a more honourable branch of the family, its towers and battlements had witnessed the slow corruption of everything they were meant to protect. Now, as midnight approached, the great hall blazed with torchlight that cast dancing shadows through windows stained with images of saints who would have wept to see what transpired below. The vampire moved through the manor's grounds with the fluid grace of spilled mercury, avoiding the lazy patrols of guards who had grown complacent after decades without real threat. Aldrich's men were bullies and thugs, effective enough against unarmed peasants, but lacking the discipline or awareness to detect a predator of his caliber. Inside the manor, Lord Aldrich held court with his inner circle. Through the great hall windows, the vampire could observe their meeting Benedict's hooded lieutenants, corrupt merchants who profited from the church's protection, and at the center of it all, Edmund Aldrich himself. At 25, the young lord had inherited all of his father's cruelty with none of the older man's caution. Where Lord Aldrich calculated each move like a chess master, Edmund acted on impulse, driven by appetites that grew more depraved with each feeding. The vampire circled the manor until he found what he sought: Edmund's private chambers in the East Tower, accessible through a window that overlooked the manor's herb gardens. The room beyond reeked of debauchery and violence, its expensive tapestries unable to mask the lingering scent of fear and blood that marked this as a place where terrible things happened to the innocent. Inside, a locked chest easily opened by fingers that possessed supernatural strength, lay Edmund's true treasures, not gold or jewels, but trophies taken from his victims. Locks of hair carefully labeled with names and dates, torn fragments of clothing that still carried the terror of their final moments. And most damning of all, a journal where Edmund recorded his spiritual exercises with sickening detail. The vampire read with growing fury as Edmund's own words painted pictures of calculated sadism disguised as religious purification. Sarah Miller had been tortured for 3 days before being sacrificed on Benedict's altar. Margaret the baker's daughter had been purified by methods that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. Each entry revealed a mind that had moved beyond mere evil into something approaching absolute corruption. You read with such intense concentration, my mysterious friend. The vampire spun to find Edmund standing in the chamber doorway, no longer wearing the fine clothes from the great hall, but instead garbed in a black robe embroidered with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. The young lord held no weapon, but confidence radiated from him like heat from a forge. "Did you truly believe we had not noticed your presence?" Edmund continued, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "Father Benedict has been aware of your kind since you first entered our territory. We have been preparing for your arrival." The vampire's enhanced senses detected the trap even as Edmund spoke. Holy water had been sprinkled around the room's perimeter, and beneath the floorboards lay iron bars inscribed with binding symbols. Not enough to hold him indefinitely, but sufficient to slow his escape while reinforcements arrived. "You have been murdering innocents," the vampire said, his voice carrying the chill of winter nights. "Tonight, that ends." Edmund laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "Murdering? Oh, my dark friend, you misunderstand our work entirely. Those girls were not murdered. They were transformed into something far more valuable. Their suffering opened doorways, their terror fed powers beyond your comprehension. Each death was an investment in our eternal prosperity. You speak of them as if they were livestock. Were they not? Peasant girls with no true purpose beyond breeding more peasants. We gave their meaningless lives cosmic significance through sacred ritual." Edmund began circling the room's perimeter, his movements suggesting a man completely confident in his safety. "But you represent something far more interesting, a creature of genuine power, sustained by darkness, untouched by the weakness that plagues mortal flesh. Father Benedict believes your essence could open doorways we have only dreamed of breaching." The vampire recognized the symptoms of corruption that ran deeper than mere human evil. Edmund's eyes held the flat reptilian gaze of something that had traded its humanity for power, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed too sharp, too numerous for any natural mouth. "What has he made you into?" the vampire asked, genuine curiosity overriding his revulsion. "What I was always meant to become. The appetites I felt as a child, the desires that polite society condemned Benedict showed me they were gifts from older gods, signs of my true nature." Edmund's form began to shift subtly, his human facade flickering like a poorly maintained illusion. "He taught me to feed on pain and terror, to transform suffering into supernatural strength. Each girl who died screaming made me more than human. The transformation was not lycanthropy or vampirism, but something else entirely. a corruption of the soul so complete that it had begun rewriting his physical form. Edmund's fingers had become claws, his spine had lengthened, and when he opened his mouth to speak, rows of needle teeth glistened in the torchlight. "You think yourself the apex predator," the transformed noble hissed, "but you are merely an animal, following instincts. I am evolution, perfected through conscious choice." The vampire smiled, revealing his own fangs for the first time since entering the manor. "Then let us see which philosophy proves superior." Edmund lunged with inhuman speed, but the vampire had been fighting supernatural creatures for 3 centuries. He sidestepped the attack and drove his silver blade deep into Edmund's transformed ribcage, directly into what should have been his heart. The corrupted noble screamed, but did not fall. Black ichor flowed from the wound instead of blood, and his flesh began knitting itself back together even as he twisted away from the blade. "Silver and faith," Edmund laughed, his voice now carrying harmonics that suggested multiple throats. "Weapons for fighting vampires and werewolves. But I am something new, something beyond your ancient arsenal." The fight that followed shattered furniture and cracked stone walls. Edmund's transformed state granted him strength, rivaling the vampire's own, but his new form lacked the discipline that came from centuries of combat experience. Where the vampire moved with surgical precision, Edmund relied on raw fury and the assumption that his corruption made him invincible. That assumption proved fatal when the vampire abandoned his silver weapons and instead grasped Edmund's signet ring, the symbol of his family's authority and the focus for his supernatural transformation. The moment his fingers closed around the ancient gold, Edmund's borrowed power began to unravel like a poorly woven tapestry. "No!" the young lord screamed as his transformed flesh began reverting to merely human frailty. "You do not understand. Without the ring, without the power, I am nothing." "You were always nothing," the vampire replied, snapping Edmund's neck with casual efficiency. "You simply convinced yourself that cruelty was the same thing as strength." As Edmund's corpse settled into final stillness, the vampire examined the signet ring more closely. The family crest had been corrupted by additional symbols, the same ones he had seen in Benedict's secret ledger. This was more than a symbol of noble authority. It was a conduit for supernatural power drawn from the suffering of innocence. Outside, the manor's bells began to toll, not calling the faithful to prayer, but announcing that the Lord's Son was dead. The vampire smiled as he prepared to depart, leaving Edmund's journal open to the page where he had described Sarah Miller's final moments. By morning, everyone in Ravenshollow would know that justice had found Edmund Aldrich, and they would begin to wonder who might be next. The church bells of Street. Cornelius tolled a funeral dirge as Edmund Aldrich's body was discovered at dawn, but beneath their mournful bronze voices, another sound echoed through the sacred halls, the grinding of ancient stone mechanisms that had not moved in decades. Father Benedict stood in his private chambers, watching through narrow windows as his carefully constructed world began to unravel. And for the first time in 40 years, genuine fear crept into his ageless heart. The ring of iron keys lay heavy in his pale hands, each one wrought with symbols that predated Christian iconography. These keys opened doors that no mortal architect had designed, passages that led beneath Street. Cornelius into chambers, where the true work of his ministry took place. Tonight, with his network under assault by an unknown enemy, Benedict would descend into those depths to seek guidance from the powers that sustained him. Ilara woke in the abandoned mill to find the vampire standing motionless beside the window, his inhuman stillness broken only by the slight rise and fall of breathing that served no biological purpose but maintained his human facade. In the grey light of early morning, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and relaxed in unconscious rhythm. "You killed him," she said, "not quite a question." "I did." His voice carried no satisfaction, only the flat certainty of completed work. Edmund Aldrich will never hurt another innocent, but his death has accelerated their timeline. Benedict knows he is being hunted. Through the mill's windows, they could see smoke rising from signal fires on the hills surrounding Ravenshallow. The entire region was being mobilized to find the killer of a lord's son, and beneath that official response, darker currents moved. Ilara had lived under the church's shadow long enough to recognize the signs of impending purification, the kind that left no witnesses and asked no inconvenient questions. "He will come for the children first," she said, understanding flooding her features with stark horror. "If Benedict cannot complete his dark moon ritual with me, he will take others, younger ones who cannot fight back." The vampire turned from the window, and she saw something in his crimson eyes that might have been her own desperate fury reflected back. "Tell me about the chambers beneath the church. You escaped from there once. I need to know the layout, the defenses, the ways in and out." Ilara closed her eyes, summoning memories she would have preferred to forget. "There is a hidden entrance behind the confessional booth, the one with the carved angels that seem to weep. The key I stole opens that door, but beyond it lies a maze of passages cut directly from the living rock." She described what she had seen during her brief, terrified captivity. Corridors that twisted back upon themselves in geometries that hurt to contemplate, chambers filled with implements that belonged in no earthly torture chamber, and at the heart of it all, the sanctum where Benedict conducted his true worship. Altars stained with centuries of sacrifice, walls carved with symbols that seemed to writhe when viewed directly, and pools of black water that reflected things that were not there. "The torture chamber lies deepest," she continued, her voice growing smaller with each word. "That is where he brings them for the final preparations. I heard the screams echo up through the stone girls who had been missing for days, broken down until they would do anything he commanded." The vampire absorbed every detail with the methodical precision of a general planning a siege. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the tactical information, but the emotional weight of what she had endured. "You were meant to be his masterwork," he said finally. "Not just another victim, but a prize offering for the Dark Moon. Your defiance intrigued him. He wanted to break something that would not bend easily. Instead, his arrogance gave me the chance to escape and find you." Ilara managed a ghost of a smile. Perhaps there is justice in that irony. The sound of approaching riders cut through their conversation. Through gaps in the mill's weathered walls, they could see a search party moving along the stream, not Benedict's usual thugs, but professional soldiers wearing the colors of the regional lord who answered to no earthly authority. These men would be thorough, disciplined, and utterly without mercy if they discovered the vampire's sanctuary. "We cannot remain here," the vampire said, already moving toward the chest where he kept his weapons and supplies. "But neither can we abandon the hunt. Benedict will use the chaos of the search to accelerate his plans." As if summoned by their fears, the distant sound of church bells began again, not the funeral tolling for Edmund, but the rapid, urgent pealing that called all faithful to immediate gathering. In the village below, they could see people emerging from their homes and moving toward street. Cornelius, with the mechanical obedience of long practice. "Emergency consecration," Ilara breathed, recognizing the signal. "He means to purify the entire village, drive out whatever evil has taken root here. But his purifications always require sacrifice," the vampire finished. "Innocent blood to wash away the sins of the community. How many will he take? As many as he needs to satisfy his dark patrons. Children, young women, anyone who cannot defend themselves or whose disappearance will not be immediately questioned." Ilara's hands shook as she gathered the few possessions she had accumulated during their brief sanctuary. "We have to stop him. Tonight." The vampire nodded, his face set in lines that spoke of decisions made and consequences accepted. "Then we will give him what he wants, a confrontation with the evil that threatens his domain. but it will not unfold as he expects. From his chest, he withdrew items that Ilara had not seen before. Vials of clear liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, daggers whose blades whispered with their own wind, and a necklace of what appeared to be human teeth strung on silver wire. "What are those?" she asked, though something in their very presence made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Tools taken from those who trafficked in corruption before Benedict was even born. Each one was sanctified by suffering, blessed by the tears of innocence, and empowered by the just rage of those who died unavenged. The vampire's voice carried the weight of centuries as he secured the items about his person. Tonight, they will serve a purpose their creators never imagined. Through the mill's walls came a new sound, the rhythmic chanting of hundreds of voices raised in unison, carrying words in Latin that seemed to twist the very air with their pronunciation. The emergency consecration had begun, and with it, Benedict's final gambit to maintain control over his corrupted domain. "He calls upon powers older than Christ," the vampire observed, listening to the chant with the attention of one who had heard such invocations before. "Powers that demand payment in innocent blood and pure suffering." The ritual will reach its climax at midnight, when the dark moon's absence creates a void in heaven's attention. "Then we have until midnight to reach the chambers and stop him?" "We have until midnight to reach the chambers," the vampire corrected. "But we will not be stopping him. We will be replacing his planned sacrifice with something he did not expect: himself." The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and beneath it came another sound that made Ilara's blood run cold: the terrified crying of children being dragged from their homes by Benedict's enforcers. The purification had claimed its first victims, and more would follow as the day progressed toward its dark conclusion. But in the abandoned mill, two very different creatures prepared for war against evil itself, each driven by their own understanding of justice and the unshakable conviction that some sins could only be answered with blood. The merchant's warehouse stood empty in the grey afternoon light, its owner having fled Raven's Hollow at the first sign of supernatural retribution. Cornelius Blackwood had been wise enough to recognize when his profitable arrangement with Father Benedict had become a liability, but not wise enough to understand that some debts follow the debtor regardless of distance traveled. The vampire found him 20 miles north of the village, cowering in a roadside inn while counting the gold he had accumulated through decades of providing specialized equipment to the church. Chains that left no marks, blades that cut without killing, and chemical compounds that heightened pain while preventing unconsciousness. Blackwood's inventory read like a catalogue of human cruelty distilled into commercial enterprise. "Please," the merchant whimpered, as inhuman hands dragged him from his rented room. "I only supplied what they requested. I never participated directly in their ceremonies. I am merely a businessman." "You are a facilitator of evil," the vampire replied, his voice carrying the cold finality of winter's last breath. "Without your tools, Benedict's tortures would have been crude and brief. Your innovations prolonged suffering and refined cruelty into an art form." The account ledgers that Blackwood carried revealed the true scope of his complicity. Not just tools of torture, but also detailed instructions for their use, chemical formulations designed to maximize agony while preserving life, and consultation services where he had personally advised Benedict on the most effective methods of breaking human resistance. The vampire's methods were swift but educational, ensuring that Blackwood experienced firsthand the effectiveness of his own innovations before darkness claimed him. By evening, another link in Benedict's network had been severed, but more importantly, valuable intelligence had been gained about the sanctum's defenses and the true nature of the coming ritual. Back in Raven's Hollow, the emergency consecration continued its grim progress. Throughout the day, Benedict's enforcers had gathered the village's most vulnerable orphaned children with no families to protect them, young women whose beauty had caught the wrong attention, and elderly villagers whose wisdom posed a threat to the church's authority. By sunset, Nearly 30 souls had been taken to the chambers beneath Street Cornelius, ostensibly for spiritual cleansing, but actually for far darker purposes. Ilara watched the procession from their new hiding place in the village's ancient cemetery, her heart breaking as she recognized faces among the captured. Little Mary Fletcher, barely 14, and guilty of nothing more than asking uncomfortable questions. Thomas the blacksmith's apprentice, whose only crime was defending his sister from unwanted advances. Old Martha's granddaughter, Elena, whose grandmother had died trying to warn others about Benedict's true nature. 30 victims, she whispered, counting the figures being led into the church's main entrance, while others were taken directly to the hidden passages. Far more than any previous ritual. He means to accomplish something unprecedented tonight. The vampire emerged from shadow beside her, his return so silent that she might have missed it entirely if not for the sudden scent of blood that clung to his clothing. "Blackwood confirmed what I suspected," he said, without preamble. "Tonight is not merely another dark moon ritual, it is Benedict's apotheosis. He intends to use the accumulated suffering of those 30 souls to transform himself into something beyond human limitations." Transform into what? Alicia, an undead creature sustained not by blood like myself, but by the direct consumption of souls. If he succeeds, he will possess power to rival archdemons, immortality that cannot be broken by holy symbols or blessed weapons, and influence that extends far beyond a single village. The implications struck Ilara like physical blows. Benedict was already corrupt beyond redemption, but as a leash, his evil would be eternal and his reach unlimited. How do we stop such a transformation? By interrupting the ritual at its most crucial moment, when Benedict has opened his soul to receive the power, but before he has fully absorbed it. In that instant of vulnerability, he can be destroyed completely. The vampire's eyes reflected the last light of sunset like pools of molten copper. But the timing must be perfect, and the cost will be higher than you might wish to pay. What cost? The vampire was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the church, where torchlight flickered behind stained glass windows that depicted scenes of martyrdom and salvation. To interrupt a leash transformation requires a willing sacrifice, a pure soul, freely offered to absorb the dark energy that would otherwise complete the transformation. Without such sacrifice, the ritual simply continues until it reaches its inevitable conclusion. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face as understanding dawned. "You mean to offer yourself? I am the logical choice. My soul has been damned for 3 centuries. Whatever purity I once possessed was forfeit when I first tasted human blood. But your soul remains clean, unmarked by true evil, despite all you have endured." His voice carried infinite gentleness, despite the horror of what he proposed. "You could stop him, Ilara. Save not just this village, but countless others he would consume in future centuries. No." The word came out with surprising force, born from depths of determination she had not known she possessed. "I will not let you sacrifice yourself for my redemption, and I certainly will not throw away my life just to deny Benedict his transformation. There must be another way. There is no other. There is always another way." Ilara turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing with the same righteous fury that had driven her to defy Benedict in the first place. "You said the ritual requires willing sacrifice of a pure soul. But what if we corrupt that requirement? What if we offer Benedict exactly what he expects, but not in the way he expects it?" The vampire studied her face with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient text. "Explain. The holy relic of Street Agnes that Benedict uses to legitimize his authority, it is a fraud, is it not? A fake created to deceive the faithful and provide supposed divine sanction for his actions." According to Blackwood's records, yes. The true relic was destroyed centuries ago. Benedict commissioned a replacement from craftsmen who specialized in religious forgeries. Ilara's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. Then his entire ritual is built upon corrupted foundations. If we can expose that corruption at the moment of transformation, introduce doubt into his certainty about divine favor, we might be able to turn his own power against him. Dangerous. The vampire mused, but she could see interest kindling in his ancient eyes. Extremely dangerous, requiring precise timing and absolute faith in our ability to manipulate forces beyond mortal comprehension. But possible. Possible, he agreed. Though it will require us to enter the sanctum during the height of the ritual, expose ourselves to supernatural forces that could destroy us both, and trust that Benedict's arrogance has made him vulnerable to a deception he would never expect. Around them, the cemetery's ancient stones seemed to lean in closer, as if the dead themselves were listening to their desperate planning. In the distance, the church bells began to toll again, not calling faithful to worship, but announcing the final phase of preparation for the night's dark work. Whatever we attempt, the vampire continued, we must understand that failure means more than our own deaths. If Benedict completes his transformation, the corruption that has poisoned this village will spread like plague across the continent. Thousands will suffer, as these 30 suffer tonight. Ilara nodded, accepting the weight of responsibility that settled across her shoulders like a burial shroud. Then we had better not fail. As full darkness fell across Ravenshollow, 2 unlikely allies prepared to descend into the depths beneath Street Cornelius, carrying with them the desperate hope that love and courage might yet triumph over evil, and the terrible knowledge that their victory, if it came at all, would be paid for in blood and sacrifice beyond imagining. The Archbishop's private study in the Cathedral of Sanctus Dominus lay 300 miles from Ravenshollow, but distance meant nothing to creatures that moved through darkness faster than horses could travel over roads. The vampire stood among scattered parchments and broken seals, reading documents that rewrote everything he thought he understood about Father Benedict's corruption. The letters bore the papal seal and were signed by Archbishop Matthias Delacroix, a man whose reputation for piety was exceeded only by his ruthless efficiency in rooting out heresy. But these communications revealed a different truth, one where the Church's highest authorities not only knew of Benedict's activities, but actively encouraged them as part of a greater design. Asterisk. The project at Ravenshollow proceeds according to divine will. Asterisk. Read one missive dated 5 years past. Asterisk. The vessel you have prepared shows remarkable resilience. When the transformation is complete, she will serve as the foundation for our expansion into the Eastern Territories. Asterisk. Another letter, more recent, contained detailed instructions for Benedict's apotheosis ritual, not stolen knowledge or forbidden lore, but official church doctrine hidden from all but the most trusted initiates. The transformation into Liche was not Benedict's personal ambition, but the culmination of decades of preparation sanctioned by Rome itself. But it was the final document that stopped the vampire's undead heart entirely, a genealogical chart traced bloodlines back through centuries, marked with symbols that designated carriers of specific spiritual traits. At the chart's center, highlighted in red ink and labeled Primary Vessel Ravenshollow Project, was a name that made his hands shake with recognition. Asterisk. Evelyn Blackthorne deceased. Plague outbreak, 1421. Descendant confirmed. Ilara Whitmore located and prepared for transformation. Asterisk. His sister's name, written in the Archbishop's careful script, connected to Ilara through bloodlines that stretched back 300 years. The girl he had sworn to protect was not merely another innocent victim, she was his sister's descendant, the last living carrier of Evelyn's bloodline, and the specific target of a conspiracy that predated his own transformation into a creature of darkness. The vampire's rage built like pressure in a sealed vessel as he read deeper into the documents. The plague that had killed Evelyn and destroyed his family had been no natural disaster, but a carefully orchestrated attack designed to eliminate threats to the church's expanding power. His sister had possessed abilities that made her dangerous to their plans, the gift of true sight that could penetrate illusions, divine protection that turned aside corrupted blessings, and, most importantly, the power to consecrate or desecrate sacred ground through the purity of her faith alone. Benedict had been present during that original purge, not as a young priest, but already ancient beyond his apparent years, sustained by dark powers even then. He had personally overseen Evelyn's death, ensuring that her abilities died with her, or so he believed. What he had not anticipated was that such gifts could pass through bloodlines, sleeping dormant for generations until the right circumstances awakened them. Ilara's ability to resist Benedict's supernatural influence, her escape from chambers designed to hold any normal prisoner, her natural immunity to the fear that paralyzed other villagers, all were manifestations of inherited power that made her the perfect vessel for the church's ultimate plan. They did not want to simply kill her, but to corrupt her gifts and turn them to their service, creating a weapon capable of consecrating evil as readily as good. The vampire crushed the genealogy chart in his fist, 3 centuries of carefully suppressed grief exploding into fury that shook the cathedral's ancient stones. He had failed to save his sister, watched her die in agony while dark priests performed their rituals of purification. Now, those same forces sought to claim her descendant, to complete the work they had begun, when he was too weak and too human to stop them. But he was no longer weak, no longer human, and no longer bound by the limitations that had made him helpless 3 centuries past. Tonight, he would settle accounts that had been too long in the reckoning. The journey back to Raven's Hollow passed in a blur of supernatural speed and mounting rage. By the time he reached the cemetery where Ilara waited, the vampire's fury had crystallized into something cold and precise, not the hot anger that clouds judgment, but the glacial wrath that burns for centuries without diminishing. He found her kneeling beside an ancient grave marker, her fingers tracing letters worn nearly smooth by time and weather. In the moonlight, her profile possessed an ethereal beauty that struck him with painful familiarity, the same delicate bone structure that had graced his sister's face, the same expression of quiet determination that had marked Evelyn's final days. "You have been busy," Ilara said without turning, somehow sensing his approach despite his supernatural stealth. "I can smell blood and old parchment, fear and revelation. What did you discover in the Archbishop's chambers?" "The truth," he replied, his voice carrying currents of emotion too deep for mortal comprehension. "About you, about your bloodline, and about why Benedict has invested decades in this single village's corruption." When he showed her the documents he had taken from the cathedral, Ilara read them with the same careful attention she might have given to scripture. But as the implications became clear, her face grew pale as winter sky, and her hands trembled with something beyond fear. "My family," she whispered, "all those stories grandmother told about ancestors who served the church, who died for their faith during the plague years. They were not martyrs, but victims of murder." "Your great-grandmother was my sister," the vampire said, each word weighted with centuries of grief. "Evelyn Blackthorne, who possessed gifts that made her a threat to the church's expansion of power. When she refused to serve their corruption, they killed her and everyone who carried her blood except for one infant daughter who was smuggled away and raised under a different name." Ilara stared at him with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond her. 19 years. "That is why you felt compelled to protect me, not mere compassion for an innocent in danger, but recognition of family blood calling to family blood." "I failed to save her," the vampire confessed, his voice breaking with the weight of ancient shame. "I was weak, human, bound by limitations that prevented me from acting when action was needed most. I swore that night, as she died in my arms, that if I ever gained the power to protect the innocent from such evil, I would use it without hesitation or mercy. And now you have that power. Now I have that power. And Benedict has made the same mistake his predecessors made 3 centuries ago. He believes that corruption always triumphs over purity, that evil is stronger than good because it is willing to use any means necessary to achieve its ends. The vampire's smile was sharp enough to cut stone. He has never faced the possibility that good might be equally willing to embrace darkness when darkness serves the cause of justice. Elara stood slowly, her movements carrying a new sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from her very bones. The gifts they speak of, I have felt them stirring since you first found me bleeding in the rain. The ability to see through illusion, to consecrate ground through faith alone, to turn their own corrupted power against them. The bloodline remembers, the vampire quoted, recalling Martha's final words. When darkness comes calling, the bloodline remembers and calls to its own kind. Then let us give Benedict exactly what he wants, Elara said, her voice carrying an edge that would have done credit to any warrior. He seeks to corrupt and claim Evelyn Blackthorn's heir. Instead, he will discover that some bloodlines carry within them the power to destroy everything he has built. Around them, the cemetery's ancient graves seem to pulse with sympathetic power, as if the dead themselves approved of the justice about to unfold. In the distance, the church bells began their midnight tolling, calling all participants to the culmination of Benedict's greatest work. But in the darkness between the tombstones, 2 descendants of different transformations prepared to honor the memory of a girl who had died 3 centuries past, and to ensure that her death would finally, definitively, be avenged. The bloodline remembered, and remembering, called for justice that transcended death itself. The hidden entrance behind the confessional booth yawned before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, its carved angels now revealed in their true form, not heavenly messengers offering comfort to the penitent, but gargoyles, leering with malevolent anticipation at the suffering to come. The confession booth key turned in its ancient lock with the sound of grinding bone, and beyond the threshold lay passages that descended into darkness older than the church above. Father Benedict's voice echoed up from the depths, no longer the measured cadence of Sunday sermons, but something altogether more primal, words in Latin that predated Christian doctrine, syllables that seemed to claw at the air itself as they rose through stone corridors, carved by hands that had never known the touch of divine grace. The Lishi transformation ritual had begun, and with each word spoken, the boundary between earth and the abyss grew thinner. The vampire moved through the descending passages with predatory silence, every sense focused on the task ahead. Behind him, Elara followed with surprising stealth for someone untrained in the arts of infiltration, her inherited gifts manifesting as an intuitive understanding of which shadows offered concealment and which stones would remain silent beneath her feet. The passages twisted through the living rock in patterns that defied conventional architecture, following ley lines that channeled supernatural energy toward the sanctum at their heart. Ancient symbols carved into the walls pulsed, with faint phosphorescence, marking the boundaries between consecrated ground above and the unhallowed depths below. Here, in chambers that had never felt sunlight, the church's true work had proceeded for decades without witness or interruption. "The screaming has stopped," Elara whispered, as they paused at a junction where 3 corridors converged. Indeed, the tortured cries that had echoed through the passages for hours had given way to an ominous silence more terrifying than any amount of audible suffering. "The preliminary phase is complete," the vampire replied, his enhanced hearing detecting subtleties in the ritual chanting that spoke of profound supernatural workings. "Benedict has broken their resistance and prepared them for the final transformation. From this point forward, they will serve willingly, not from choice, but because their capacity for choice has been systematically destroyed." They moved deeper into the labyrinth, past chambers that contained implements of torture refined through centuries of use. Iron maidens whose spikes were positioned to inflict maximum agony without causing death. Racks designed to stretch human joints beyond their natural limits while preserving consciousness. Tables grooved with channels to collect blood for use in dark sacraments. Each device bore the patina of extensive use and careful maintenance, testament to the systematic nature of the evil that flourished in these depths. The vampire's supernatural senses detected the presence of the 30 victims ahead, their life forces dimmed but not extinguished, transformed into something that registered as neither fully human nor entirely lost to corruption. Benedict had achieved something unprecedented in his decades of dark practice, the creation of willing vessels whose suffering would fuel his transformation, while their souls provided the spiritual energy necessary for apotheosis. "Here," Elara said, stopping before an alcove that appeared empty but radiated wrongness like heat from a forge. "This is where I was held before my escape. There should be a passage." Her words were cut short, as the alcove's shadows suddenly coalesced into solid form. Brother Marcus stepped from the darkness, no longer the gaunt deacon who had enforced Benedict's will through mundane cruelty, but something transformed by prolonged exposure to the sanctum's corrupt energies. His flesh had taken on the translucent quality of old parchment, and his eyes reflected light like polished obsidian. "The bloodline returns to complete the circle," Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple throats speaking in unison. "Father Benedict has been expecting you, child of Evelyn. Your ancestors' gifts will serve a greater purpose than she ever imagined possible." The transformed deacon moved with inhuman speed, but the vampire was faster still. Silver daggers flashed in the phosphorescent light as he intercepted Marcus's attack, blessed metal meeting. Corrupted flesh in a spray of ichor that hissed against the ancient stone. But where Edmund's transformation had been crude and unstable, Marcus had been refined through years of gradual corruption into something approaching perfection. "You fight to preserve the illusion of innocence," Marcus taunted as they circled each other in the narrow corridor. "But innocence is merely ignorance of cosmic truth. Benedict offers transcendence beyond the petty moral limitations that bind lesser souls." "Benedict offers only the corruption of everything good in the world," Elara replied, her voice carrying a new quality that made the very air around her shimmer with potential energy. "But some bloodlines carry within them the power to cleanse as well as consecrate." She raised her hand toward Marcus, and light flowed from her fingers, not the harsh glare of torches or candles, but pure radiance that revealed the deacon's true form. Beneath his transformed exterior, she could see the network of corruption that sustained him, dark veins of spiritual poison that had replaced his natural life force with something borrowed from the abyss itself. Marcus screamed as the light touched him, his carefully maintained form beginning to unravel like cloth exposed to acid. "Impossible. The gifts died with your ancestor." Benedict himself ensured. "Benedict ensured nothing," the vampire said, driving a blessed dagger directly into the center of the corruption that powered Marcus's transformation. He simply assumed that evil was stronger than good because he had never faced good, backed by equal determination to use any means necessary. As Marcus's form collapsed into component shadows that fled back into the darkness from which they had come, the vampire and Elara continued their descent toward the sanctum. Behind them, the alcove where she had been held prisoner began to glow with the same pure light that had unmade the corrupted deacon, as if her presence was slowly purifying the very stone that had witnessed her suffering. The final descent led them through a gallery lined with alcoves containing the preserved remains of Benedict's previous victims, girls and young women whose deaths had fueled lesser rituals over the decades, their bodies mummified by the supernatural energies that permeated the depths. Each face bore the expression of final moments that combined agony with terrible understanding, as if they had glimpsed the cosmic purpose their suffering served before darkness claimed them. "So many," Ilara whispered, her inherited gifts allowing her to sense the lingering echoes of torment that clung to each preserved form. How did no one know? How did no one stop this? They knew, the vampire replied, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries spent witnessing human evil. Some participated willingly for profit or protection. Others looked away because the truth was too terrible to acknowledge. And a few tried to act, only to disappear into these very chambers when they grew too persistent in their questions. At the gallery's end, massive doors of black iron stood open, revealing the sanctum beyond. The chamber was vast, beyond the physical dimensions that the church above could contain, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life. At its center stood an altar of obsidian that reflected not light, but the suffering of those who had died upon it, and around that altar 30 figures knelt in perfect stillness. Father Benedict stood behind the altar, no longer maintaining his human facade, but revealed in his true form, ageless, terrible, and radiating power that bent reality around him like gravity wells bend space. In his hands, he held the fraudulent relic of Street Agnes, its false blessing now revealed as the focus for energies drawn directly from the abyss itself. "Welcome, children of Blackthorn blood," he said, his voice carrying across the sanctum with preternatural clarity. 3 centuries I have waited for this moment, when Evelyn's legacy would return to complete the work she died trying to prevent. Tonight, her bloodline will serve a purpose greater than any earthly good, the birth of immortal evil that will reshape this world according to divine will. Around the altar, the 30 victims began to glow with internal light, not the pure radiance that flowed from Ilara, but the sickly phosphorescence of spiritual energy being systematically harvested for unholy purpose. Their sacrifice would provide the power for Benedict's transformation, while Ilara's corruption would grant him dominion over sacred forces themselves. "You are too late to save them," Benedict continued, raising the false relic above the altar as the ritual reached its crucial phase. "And you are exactly on time to fulfill your own destiny. Take your place beside your ancestors' spirit child, and witness the birth of a new age where faith serves its true master." The vampire's hand found the silver chain that had once held his sister's locket, its broken links a tangible reminder of 3 centuries of grief and determination. "You are right about one thing, priest. Tonight, Evelyn's legacy will be complete, but not in the way you imagine." As the ritual reached its crescendo and supernatural forces gathered like storm clouds in the sanctum's vaulted darkness, 2 descendants of different transformations prepared to honor a promise made in blood and sealed with suffering that transcended death itself. The bloodline had remembered, and remembering had come home at last. The sanctum's obsidian altar began to pulse with malevolent energy as Benedict raised the fraudulent relic higher, its false blessing now revealed as a conduit for powers that had never known heaven's light. Around the altar, the 30 victims swayed in perfect unison, their life forces already partially harvested, their souls suspended between earth and abyss while they awaited the final moment of consumption. The vampire stepped into the sanctum's unhallowed ground and immediately felt the burning agony as consecrated stone twisted and corrupted, though it was rebelled against his supernatural essence. Each footstep sent waves of purifying fire through his undead flesh, but he pressed forward, driven by purpose that transcended mere physical torment. "You feel it, don't you?" Benedict called out, his voice carrying notes of genuine sympathy beneath its triumphant mockery. "The holy ground tears at your very existence, reminds you of what you were before darkness claimed you. But it need not be so painful, creature of shadow. Accept your place in my new order, and I will grant you dominion over regions where your nature will be celebrated rather than punished." "I have walked through flames for 3 centuries," the vampire replied, his voice steady despite the agony that threatened to overwhelm his consciousness. A little more fire will not deter me from keeping promises made to the innocent dead. Behind him, Elara moved with growing confidence, her inherited gifts manifesting more clearly with each step into the sanctum's heart. Where the vampire burned, she seemed to glow with internal radiance that pushed back the chamber's oppressive darkness. The corrupted ground beneath her feet began to shift, stones cracking and reforming as her presence challenged the very foundations upon which Benedict had built his unholy temple. Fascinating, Benedict observed, lowering the relic momentarily as he studied Ilara's transformation. Evelyn's gifts manifest more strongly in you than they ever did in her. Perhaps because you have been tempered by suffering, refined through trials that would have broken a weaker spirit. You will make a far superior vessel than I originally anticipated. The priest gestured toward the kneeling victims, and their forms began to rise from the obsidian floor, moving with the jerky motions of marionettes controlled by an inexpert puppeteer. Their eyes reflected nothing of human consciousness, only the empty void that remained when souls were systematically harvested for dark purpose. They volunteered, Benedict said with obscene pride. Not willingly at first, but I helped them understand the cosmic significance of their sacrifice. Each death will fuel my transformation, but yours, dear child, will grant me dominion over the very concept of sacred ground itself. The vampire's enhanced senses detected the supernatural mechanisms that powered Benedict's control over his victims, threads of spiritual energy that connected each soul to the obsidian altar, binding them to his will through carefully orchestrated trauma and corruption. But those same senses also revealed something Benedict had not anticipated. Ilara's growing power was beginning to interfere with those connections, introducing discord into what should have been perfect harmony. You made one crucial error in your calculations. The vampire said, circling the altar's perimeter while careful to avoid direct contact with its corrupt radiance. You assumed that Evelyn's bloodline carried only the gift of consecration. You never considered that it might also carry the gift of purification. Purification? Benedict laughed, the sound echoing through the sanctum's vaulted darkness like the cry of some predatory bird. This ground was consecrated centuries before your sister drew her first breath. It has been sanctified by the suffering of hundreds, blessed by rituals that reach back to the very foundations of faith itself. What can one girl's untrained gifts accomplish against such accumulated power? In answer, Ilara stepped forward and placed her palm against the obsidian altar's surface. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Cracks of pure light spread from her touch, racing through the black stone like lightning frozen in crystal. Where the light touched, the altar's corrupt radiance began to falter, its connection to abyssal powers wavering like a candle flame in storm wind. Benedict's expression of triumph transformed into something approaching panic as he felt his carefully constructed ritual begin to unravel. Impossible! The altar was carved from stone that predates Christian doctrine, blessed by powers older than your pathetic Christ. Older, perhaps, Ilara replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of reality, but not stronger than faith backed by righteous purpose. Some bloodlines remember truths that predate your corruption, priest. Tonight, you learn the difference between sacred and merely old. The fraudulent relic of street. Agnes began to smoke in Benedict's hands as Ilara's power interfaced directly with its false blessings. 3 centuries of accumulated lies and manufactured holiness combusted in the face of genuine spiritual authority, revealing the relic's true nature, not a sacred artifact, but a focus for channeling abyssal energies disguised as divine favor. Around the altar, the 30 victims began to stir, as the threads binding them to Benedict's will started to fray. Some collapsed entirely as their stolen life force rushed back into bodies not prepared to contain it, while others looked around with dawning awareness of where they were and what had been done to them. "You understand nothing," Benedict snarled, raising the burning relic despite the agony it now caused him to touch. I offer transcendence beyond the petty moral limitations that bind lesser souls. I serve powers that shaped reality before your precious angels drew their first breath. You serve yourself, the vampire said, moving closer to the altar as its corruption weakened under Ilara's assault. You have always served yourself, priest. Everything else, your God, your church, your grand cosmic purpose, all of it has been elaborate justification for indulging appetites that would shame the demons you claim to serve. The sanctum's walls began to tremble as competing spiritual forces warred for dominance over ground that had been corrupted for centuries, but was now experiencing the first touch of genuine consecration it had known since its construction. In that moment of perfect balance between light and darkness, Benedict made his final, desperate gambit. He plunged the burning relic directly into his own chest, screaming words in tongues that had never known human throats, calling upon powers that answered from depths beyond naming. The moment the fraudulent relic pierced Benedict's chest, the sanctum exploded into chaos as competing spiritual forces tore reality apart at its seams. The priest's body convulsed as abyssal energy poured through the burning artifact, his human form struggling to contain power meant for vessels far more durable than mortal flesh. But instead of the controlled transformation he had planned, Benedict's desperate gambit had opened him to forces beyond his ability to direct or survive. Dark energy erupted from the altar in waves that shattered stone and sent the freed victims stumbling toward whatever exits they could find. The vampire threw himself between Ilara and the worst of the supernatural backlash, his undead constitution better suited to absorb the punishment than her mortal frame. But even his supernatural resilience had limits, and each wave of corrupted power that struck him felt like being flayed alive by invisible knives. "The chain!" Ilara shouted over the thunderous sound of reality, reasserting itself against Benedict's violations. "Your sister's locket chain, it carries her spiritual imprint." Through the chaos, the vampire saw what she meant. The broken silver chain that he had carried for 3 centuries was glowing with the same pure radiance that flowed from Ilara's touch, responding to her proximity by manifesting the spiritual essence of the woman who had worn it in life. Evelyn's presence filled the sanctum like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and where that presence touched, Benedict's corruption began to wither. Benedict's transformation was not proceeding as planned. Instead of becoming a leash sustained by the methodical consumption of souls, his desperate attempt to absorb power through the fraudulent relic was turning him into something unstable, a creature caught between human mortality and supernatural transcendence. Neither fully alive nor properly undead. His flesh rippled with patterns that suggested scales one moment and rotting bark the next, while his eyes blazed with fires that consumed more than they illuminated. "You have ruined everything," Benedict screamed, his voice now carrying the harmonics of wind through broken stone. 3 centuries of preparation, decades of careful cultivation, all destroyed by meddling children who understand nothing of cosmic necessity. "We understand enough," Ilara replied, pressing her advantage as the purification of the altar accelerated under the portal. Combined influence of her gifts and Evelyn's lingering spirit. "We understand that some hungers cannot be satisfied, some appetites cannot be justified, and some evils must be stopped, regardless of the cost." The vampire unwound the silver chain from around his wrist and advanced on Benedict's writhing form. Each step across the increasingly purified ground brought less agony and more purpose, as if Ilara's presence was transforming the sanctum from a temple of corruption into something approaching actual consecration. The chain in his hands felt warm now rather than cold, alive with memories of the woman who had worn it and the love that had sustained him through 3 centuries of hunting. "Evelyn sends her regards," the vampire said, wrapping the silver chain around Benedict's throat as the priest's unstable transformation reached its crisis point. The effect was immediate and absolute. The moment the chain touched Benedict's flesh, Every lie he had ever told, every innocent he had corrupted, every soul he had harvested, came crashing down upon him with the weight of divine judgment. The fraudulent relic crumbled to ash in his chest cavity, its false blessings revealed as empty promises that collapsed under the pressure of genuine spiritual authority. Benedict's scream transcended sound, becoming something that bypassed the ears entirely and struck directly at the consciousness of everyone within the sanctum's walls. It was the cry of someone who had spent decades believing himself chosen by cosmic forces, only to discover in his final moments that he had been deceived by his own pride and ambition. The powers he had served cared nothing for his grand plans. They had simply used him as a convenient tool for spreading corruption until someone stronger came to claim his territory. As the chain tightened around his throat, Benedict's unstable form began to collapse inward, like a building whose foundation had been removed. The spiritual energy he had stolen over decades of dark ritual returned to its sources, flowing back to the victims who had survived their ordeals and bringing peace to those who had not. The sanctum's walls cracked as the supernatural forces that had sustained them for centuries suddenly withdrew, leaving only mundane stone to bear the weight of time and guilt. "Please," Benedict whispered, his voice reduced to barely human tones, as his transformation finally completed, not into the immortal Lisha he had envisioned, but into something pitiable and finite. "I served faithfully. I followed the path they showed me. I did everything required." "You served yourself," the vampire replied, his voice carrying no satisfaction, only the weary finality of justice too long delayed. "You followed paths that led only to your own aggrandizement, and you did everything required to ensure your own destruction." The chain snapped tight with the sound of breaking glass, and Father Benedict's centuries of accumulated corruption came to an end in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His body crumbled to dust that was immediately swept away by winds that seemed to blow from some other realm entirely, carrying the last traces of his evil beyond the boundaries of the mortal world. In the sudden silence that followed, the vampire and Ilara stood amid the ruins of the sanctum, surrounded by empty chains and broken altars, breathing air that tasted clean for the first time in decades. Above them, the first light of dawn began to filter down through cracks in the stone, carrying with it the promise of a world where corruption would no longer flourish in darkness. The bloodline had remembered, and remembering, had finally claimed justice for wrongs that spanned 3 centuries. Dawn broke over Ravenshollow for the first time in decades, without the shadow of corruption darkening its light. From the hillside cemetery, where they had emerged after the sanctum's collapse, the vampire and Ilara watched the sun paint the village in shades of gold and amber that seemed impossibly bright after so many years of muted greys. The church bells that had once tolled for dark purposes now rang with clear, sweet notes that carried across the valley like a promise of renewal. The vampire stood beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, its shadow providing the protection he needed from direct sunlight, while still allowing him to witness the transformation taking place below. But something had changed during the night's events. The burning agony he usually felt in Dawn's presence had diminished to a manageable warmth, as if his participation in purifying the sanctum had somehow purified him as well. "They will rebuild," Ilara said, watching as villagers emerged from their homes to help the survivors who had escaped from the underground chambers. Not just the buildings Benedict corrupted, but their faith in goodness, their trust in each other, their belief that justice can prevail against even the darkest evil. The survivors numbered 23 of the original 30 victims, their bodies weakened, but their spirits intact, thanks to the spiritual energy that had flowed back to them when Benedict's control shattered. Young Mary Fletcher had been among the first to emerge from the ruins, helping to carry those too injured to walk while organizing the rescue efforts with the natural authority of someone who had looked into darkness and chosen to return to light. "And what of us?" the vampire asked, studying Ilara's profile as she gazed down at the village with eyes that seemed older than her 19 years. What becomes of a creature of darkness and a woman touched by divine gifts when the mission that brought them together reaches its completion? Ilara turned to face him fully, and in her expression he saw something that might have been his sister's smile, gentle, understanding, and touched with mischief. Perhaps the mission was never about completion. Perhaps it was about transformation. Over the past week, as the village slowly returned to normal life, they had watched that transformation take many forms. Lord Aldrich had fled his manor in the night, taking only what gold he could carry, and leaving behind a estate that the survivors had claimed as compensation for their suffering. The corrupt merchants who had supplied Benedict's operation found themselves facing justice from magistrates who were no longer under the priest's supernatural influence. Most remarkably, the vampire himself had begun to change. Not physically, he remained the pale, predatory creature that centuries of dark existence had made him, but spiritually, the constant hunger that had driven him for 300 years had evolved into something more selective, more purposeful. He could still sustain himself on blood when necessary, but he found increasing satisfaction in protecting the innocent and hunting those who preyed upon them. "I have been thinking about Martha's words," Ilara continued, settling beside him on the cemetery's ancient stone bench. "About guardians who walk between light and shadow, creatures who protect the innocent when daylight fails to serve. Perhaps that was never just legend. Perhaps it was prophecy." In the village below, a new priest had arrived, Father Thomas, a young man whose genuine faith radiated like warmth from a hearth fire. His first act had been to consecrate a mass grave for those who had died in Benedict's chambers, offering prayers that actually seemed to reach heaven rather than being absorbed by supernatural darkness. His second had been to begin organizing the rebuilding of trust that would be far more difficult than reconstructing any physical structure. "The church will send investigators," the vampire observed. "They will want to understand what happened here, how one of their own could fall so completely into corruption without detection." "Let them investigate," Ilara replied with confidence that surprised him. "They will find a village where evil was defeated by courage and love, where corruption was cleansed by sacrifice and determination. Some truths transcend institutional politics." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horse hooves echoed from the road below. A small party approached the village, not soldiers or church officials, but travelers who bore the dust of long journeys and the wariness of those who had heard disturbing rumors. Among them rode a woman whose bearing suggested nobility, though she wore simple traveling clothes rather than court finery. "Lady Catherine Whitmore," Ilara breathed, recognizing the rider despite years of separation. "My mother's sister, who disappeared when the family was scattered after the plague years. She survived." The vampire's enhanced senses detected the spiritual resonance that marked Catherine as another carrier of Evelyn's bloodline. Though her gifts had manifested differently, not as Ilara's power to purify corruption, but as an ability to find and gather others who carried traces of the same heritage. She had spent decades searching for survivors, building a network of protection for those whose gifts made them targets of forces like Benedict's corruption. "She brings others," the vampire observed, noting the way the traveling party moved, with the coordination of people bound by shared purpose rather than mere coincidence. "Others like you, carrying fragments of power that could be dangerous in the wrong hands or valuable in the right ones." "A family," Ilara said, wonder coloring her voice. "After all these years of believing I was alone, there are others who share the bloodline, who understand the gifts and the responsibilities they bring." The new dawn bell began to ring in the village below, not the corrupted bronze that had served Benedict's purposes, but a new bell cast from silver donated by grateful survivors. Its voice carried clearly through the morning air, announcing not just the hour but the beginning of a new chapter in Ravenshallow's history. The vampire rose from the stone bench, his movements fluid despite the early light that still caused him discomfort. Then your real work begins now. Not just healing one village, but building something larger, a network of guardians who can stand against corruption wherever it takes root. Our work, Ilara corrected, extending her hand toward him. Some missions are too important to attempt alone, and some transformations require both darkness and light to accomplish. As her fingers touched his, the vampire felt something he had not experienced since his sister's death 3 centuries past. Not just purpose, but belonging. Together, they walked down the hillside toward the village where Lady Catherine waited with news of others who shared their gifts and their mission. Behind them, the cemetery's ancient stones caught the morning light like prisms, casting rainbows across graves that had witnessed centuries of sorrow, but would now stand guard over a community learning to hope again. In the distance, the first flowers of spring pushed through soil that had been watered with tears, but would now nurture new growth. The bloodline had remembered, and remembering, had chosen to build rather than simply avenge, to protect rather than simply punish, to love rather than simply rage. And in that choice, monsters became guardians, darkness served light, and justice became not an ending, but a beginning.